In an attempt to define the female gaze, some feminist film theorists have developed the theory that the female gaze is a subversion of the male gaze, the uniquely feminine perspective that focuses on sight and touch. Celine Sciamma's 2019 film Portrait of a Lady on Fire is an example of a film which can not only be viewed through a female gaze, but also through a queer female gaze, which works to separate itself from the heterosexual male gaze entirely. But first, what is the male gaze? The male gaze, as coined by Laura Mulvey in her 1973 essay, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, is defined as how women in film are typically depicted as a sexual object meant to be viewed and desired specifically by the male audience. The male gaze is everywhere in Hollywood, from Megan Fox hunched over a car, Harley Quinn stripping as she suits up in a superhero costume, to just about every film poster used to advertise. There really is no escaping it. And that's kind of the point. Viewing women as a segmented body, dehumanized, sexualized, and disembodied, has become an industry standard, or rather, it has been the standard since the inception of cinema. Male directors, cinematographers, and writers have dominated filmmaking for so long that the male gaze has been replicated over and over to the point where it is ingrained into the dominant culture of cinema. Its normalization has led to any film which strays from or subverts the male gaze is seen as a seismic and almost radical shift, even if the film is simply giving a new perspective outside of the male gaze. And this is where the female gaze comes in. The female gaze is still in the developmental stages of understanding and examination, so there isn't yet a clear and universal definition of it. Rather, it's defined as an umbrella term housing many possible theories. One such theory is that the female gaze isn't about asserting female dominance on screen, and it doesn't mean that we therefore get to objectify men in reverse. So while the female gaze may be the subversion of the male gaze, it isn't as simple as switching who is being viewed and who is looking. It's about the way they are viewing. The female gaze works to use the camera as a lens which portrays the feminine perspective, and it doesn't rely on the dominant versus submissive viewership that typical male scopophilia operates in. Instead, the female gaze emphasizes on sight and touch, through which a feminine perspective is clearly heard and portrayed through the film. Sight is central to understanding the female gaze, because when a film truly portrays the feminine gaze, it does so in a way that does not sexualize or objectify the subject. The viewership is not voyeuristic or hidden in a way that the male gaze is defined to be. Instead, its goal is to truly understand the other person, to see them as whole and not just on surface level, which is much different than the way the male gaze often works to undress the female subject with their eyes. The gaze is shared by two people when shown through the female gaze work to create an emotional bond reinforced by the fact that it comes from a balanced perspective. Unlike the hierarchy between men and women in the male gaze, the female ensures that the power dynamic between the two subjects are balanced. This means that the female gaze is not restricted to a simply female viewer. It could be a man looking at a woman, or a man looking at a man, so long as the goal of the gaze is to truly understand the other person. The attention to touch also works to define the female gaze. The significance of female touch is etched into feminist art history. Artwork created by women, which emphasize hands, as well as showing women as healers or using their hands to heal, are very prevalent throughout works of art, and the female gaze often replicates this emphasis on hands in film, such as Darcy's hand flex in the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice. Portrait of a Lady on Fire can easily be read through the female gaze. In a way, it's a manifesto to it, by dismantling and reconstructing the male gaze. However, it is actually more impactful and more accurate to view the film through a queer female gaze, as the film centers around the romance between two women in 18th century France. The importance of sight, and for Marianne and Heloise to truly see each other, is highlighted from their first meeting. Heloise is draped in a coat and hood, hiding her face. She walks quickly ahead so that both Marianne and the audience are kept from viewing her until she dramatically turns and her piercing blue eyes accentuate the consensual viewing. This consensual viewing is important because Heloise dictates when she consents to be viewed, establishing from the beginning of the film that the power dynamic is neutral. The time period in which the film is set is important because it influences how the female gaze is used throughout the film. The film is set during a time where heteronormacy was not only the norm, it was expected. Therefore, before the gaze can be used to understand each other, it must be used by either Marianne or Heloise to determine if their feelings for each other are mutual, without giving away their attraction in an obvious way. This is achieved in the film through longing stares that do not break eye contact. Although nothing is directly said during these longing stares, the subtext and uninterruptedness conveys to each other that the feelings are mutual. We, the audience, watch the film through the eyes of Marianne. and this allows for us to be able to see how she exactly views Heloise. Through shots that focus on small features, such as her neck, ears, and hands, Marianne's desire for Heloise is obvious, but the camera ensures that Heloise is not objectified or sexualized in a dehumanizing way. The close-ups of Heloise's features don't leave her as a disembodied figure of lust, shown through the male gaze. Instead, those small fragments of body parts work as a mosaic in portraying Heloise as a full figure, because her eyes and face are shown just as often. Every shot of her face and her eyes conveys emotion and depth. Both Marianne and the audience want to know what she is thinking. By the way the camera captures Heloise, it is clear that she isn't just some hollow romantic interest whose only purpose in the film is for Marianne to pursue and win. Instead, she's a fully fleshed out character, with a personality and goals, just as the protagonist Marianne is. Touch is used in primarily two ways throughout the film. First, touch is used in the literal sense, where Marianne and Heloise use touch to express and explore their desire for each other. Every touch is steeped in the feminine gaze, but it isn't always about sexual desire. It's clear that the two women want to understand each other, and touch is a vessel to do so. Just as sight is tiptoed around in the beginning of the film, touch is restrained. There can be no outward or direct displays of affection in case either woman's attraction is not reciprocated. And so when Marianne first touches Heloise, it is through small, routine gestures such as fixing her placement while painting her. When Marianne and Heloise have established a desire for each other, the touch is always consensual and loving. Where there could be a sex scene, the film instead cuts, ensuring that the lesbian relationship is not fetishized. This is a stark contrast to most Hollywood depictions and even queer-focused films, such as The Blue is the Warmest Color, which use lesbian sex to appeal to the male gaze and uphold the male fantasy. The second way touch is used in the film is through Marianne's paintings of Heloise. Marianne's hands are capable of producing art that truly reflects how she sees Heloise. The film is aware that it operates within the female gaze because Marianne's first portrait is anything other than how she truly sees Heloise. Heloise asks, "Is this how you see me?" And it isn't. Marianne was commissioned to paint Heloise so that the painting could be shown to a potential suitor, and so the portrait was painted through the male gaze, emphasizing Heloise's body rather than her face. Her face, when shown, is devoid of any emotion. It is blank and inaccurate. Marianne's second portrait, however, is painted through the female gaze, and it portrays Heloise not only as how Marianne views her, but as a whole person. The theme that I believe is central to the film, and which ties in both sight and touch, is that of yearning. The entire movie is about the longingness and intentionality of Marianne and Heloise's gazes and touch. The emphasis on yearning is clear through the cinematography, editing, and even sound design, which is filled with silence. Sciamma's use of the female gaze is evident in every aspect of the filmmaking. The female gaze is truly achieved in this film because of the filmmakers. The director of photography, and writers are all women, meaning the film is through a specifically female lens, without the significant influence of men. The absence of men is important to the film, both on screen and behind the camera, because it allows for a true female perspective to explore themes of femininity and queerness with an unrestricted female voice.